morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael from Bloomberg Opinion. Thank you for joining this Bloomberg Opinion live stream today. Today, we're talking about the shifting U.S.-Ukraine relationship and how that will affect U.S. standing in the world and our domestic politics here at home. With me is Andreas Kluth, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist covering diplomacy, national security, and geopolitics. And we are also joined by Nia Malika Henderson, who is our U.S. politics columnist based in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for being here this morning. Andreas, let's start with you. And I would love it if you could just bring us up to speed. So much has happened in a relatively tight timetable with, Trump's apparent pivot to Russia, him calling Zelenskiy a dictator, recent developments at NATO and the UN. Can you just recap for us where we are now?
I think we've just gone in the space of 2 weeks through a turning point in history. No exaggeration. I think we were all afraid of this. There was no news in a way since 2016 that Trump had certain instincts. I'll just abbreviate them as pro-Putin, anti-Zelenskiy, anti-Ukraine, pro-dictators, anti-rules-based order. But he confirmed that in the past 2 weeks, and with a number of just absolutely outrageous, mind-boggling, and incredible, as in literally hard to believe, things that he said and did. Number one, he gave a Mar-a-Lago press conference where he inverted, not just distorted, he did that too, but inverted reality. So that Ukraine is now the country that started the war, and Russia is now, in his mind, the country that wants to end the suffering. This is the same Russia that committed atrocities and more at Bucha, kidnapped Ukrainian children, and so forth. So he's inverted reality. The next day, in a social media post, Trump doubled down and called Zelenskiy of Ukraine a dictator, not Putin. Macron visited yesterday. Somebody asked Trump straight up, do you consider Putin a dictator too? He refused to answer. Just want to put a symbolic thing on top of that. Yesterday at the United Nations, for the first time that I can remember, I think for the first time ever, the United States 3 times voted with Russia and against Ukraine and the Europeans, twice in the General Assembly, once in the Security Council. All 3 times, the issue was the war in Ukraine and whether or not you could give moral equality to Russia and Ukraine. And the U.S. is now siding with Russia against Ukraine. This is now explicit. What we always were afraid of, and people said, oh, you're taking him literally, but not seriously, and you're hysterical. This gaslighting, what we were afraid of, he's now proving again and again, day after day. So is this Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who, meeting in Brussels, essentially already gave away the best bargaining chips for peace talks, saying, no, there will never be U.S. troops on the ground. No, Ukraine will never be in NATO. These are things for in the late stages of the negotiations to preserve, if you know the art of the deal, title of Trump's book. So America in the past 2 weeks formally switched sides away from the camp of the democracies into the camp of the autocracies. From now on, it is about carving up the world among dictators. China, Russia, the US is now among them, into spheres of influence at the expense of small countries. And the first of those is Ukraine.
So some of this has created a little bit of pushback at home among Republicans who until now have been in pretty lockstep with Trump. But, they did come out and some of them said things like, Putin is the dictator. Russia started this war. But Nia, does any of that really mean anything? Did it surprise you? Or is it just sort of symbolic pushback?
It's symbolic and it's small. I mean, it's like the dead-ender rump part of the Republican Party's foreign policy orientation, which, you think of people like John McCain, you think of people like Lindsey Graham, who, in fairness, has been part of that, even though he's changed his outlook on many things in the Trump era. He has been defending Zelensky. He has been saying that America should defend democracy and be a beacon of democracy on the world stage, as the country has been for many, many decades. You heard, for instance, Tom Tillis, who's a North Carolina senator, give a pretty impassioned speech in the well of the Senate, again talking about Putin as the dictator, talking about Russia as the biggest threat that he has seen in his lifetime. And so there's that, but it is small, right? If you think about where most of the people are on the House side, they are in lockstep with Donald Trump. You heard on some of the Sunday shows, some of the Republicans essentially echoing Donald Trump's talking points and saying, well, yeah, actually, Ukraine, maybe it wasn't the aggressor, but it provoked Russia by wanting to be in NATO, for instance. And then you have, I think, a Republican base who looks at America's foreign policy historically and sees a lot of wasted revenue, wasted sort of blood and treasure if you look at Iraq and you look at Afghanistan. And so there is now a reaction to that. That is what Donald Trump ran on, this idea that America had spent too much abroad and it was time to take care of folks at home. So there is a real realignment, I think, of where the Republican Party was. And you have Democrats who have typically not been the biggest defenders of foreign intervention, now saying this is a bedrock principle of America, that you defend weak countries, you help defend weak countries against more powerful countries. So they are the ones who are holding together any sort of pro-Ukraine, anti-Putin coalition, but it is certainly weak in the face of Donald Trump, who is making it known over and over again that he is taking America out of the Western alliance. And Andreas, you wrote about this and obviously spoke about it just now. If you look at that UN resolution, America is siding with not only Russia, but North Korea. Right? It's a complete reversal of the kind of America we've known for decades, and the kind of world that America helped order to prevent these kinds of incursions and this idea that might makes right.
If I can just add one thing to what Nia said for emphasis, because it is worth just looking at the list of countries with which America voted in the General Assembly. As Nia said, Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Syria. That's the club we're in now.
Yeah, that's a really surprising realignment. And I think, despite some of the misgivings of some senators in both parties about that, that seems to be where Trump wants to take the country. And so I'm just wondering, what effect does that have on our longstanding democracy alliances with democracies, Andreas?
Our alliances we have about 70 allies, depending on the definition. And that was longstanding policy, controversial whether more is always better, but we used to see them, Republican and Democrat, both parties since World War II, as a forward defense, as a force multiplier, as a good thing, as an asset. We had allies. China, for instance, doesn't have many. It has one, North Korea, formally. That has been in trouble for a long time because Trump always spoke out against NATO. John Bolton, who used to be his national security advisor, said that wrote a book saying he believed he wants to pull formally out of NATO. He may yet do that, but it doesn't even have to be a formal exit from alliances. He's already rattled the foundations. That's why Macron is so nervous and Starmer as they're visiting this week, because he's casting doubt on the mutual defense clause in, for example, the NATO treaty. That's Article 5. He's making clear that he sides psychologically with Putin and not the allies. And it doesn't, for that purpose, even matter if Trump is gone in 4 years, because I just want to recall a conversation between Biden and Macron when Biden took over, and Biden went around saying, America is back. And Macron said, for how long? Because if you think of something very simple, like let's say a country like South Korea, Japan, Poland, and Germany, they have to consider and debate fundamental questions like this nuclear umbrella. Will America protect us with its nuclear arms? If that's not clear, then and we might have to build our own. That is a decision that spans several administrations. That's not like here 1 week, then he says something else the next week. So our alliances are undermined. And of course, the main point of alliances is deterrence. It's the psychology. It's what does the enemy, the adversary, what is their understanding of American commitment to come to the aid of its allies? And if that is in question, and it is certainly in question, it is, I think, in doubt, then the adversaries will behave differently. They will act differently. They may miscalculate or just recalculate. Someone like Kim Jong-un in North Korea may do something we really don't want him to do.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Andreas, the Hegseth sort of giving away the store in terms of just putting on the table a bunch of promises, with nothing in return. And it strikes me that not only, has the administration kind of upended the alliances, the calculations made by the adversaries, but then the thing that Trump has always said he's good at, this art of the deal. I mean, Hegseth just goes out there and kind of doesn't really set America up to make a good deal. I mean, but Nia, you watch those Hegseth confirmation hearings. Isn't this kind of what the senators were worried about when they were asking him if he was qualified for this job?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone knew with the appointment of Hegseth that he would be a rubber stamp for Donald Trump's policies. Marco Rubio, the same thing, who again had been a part of the old GOP in thinking about democracy, thinking about America's unique role in the world. And now he is part of the negotiations, part of the rhetoric, the pro-Putin rhetoric, the giving away the store to Putin even before any negotiations begin, and even essentially cutting Zelensky out initially of any negotiations. There, of course, is now talk about, is there going to be some transfer of mineral rights? There's also discussion about how much those are worth even. Are they worth as much as Donald Trump thinks they're worth? And are there security guarantees as part of that, which is something that Zelensky is thinking about? But you do see Donald Trump's pro-Putin approach, which has gone back many, many years, and the transactional nature, right? We have given all of these billions of dollars, he likes to say, and now we are owed, and perhaps that comes in the form of these rare earth minerals, Donald Trump's logic there. So we will see, but it is extraordinary. I think, to Andreas's point, these last 2 weeks have been historic in the way that they have transformed American history going forward, the way that the globe is ordered. And what was remarkable as well, you saw J.D. Vance, because you think about how long does this last, right? And you see J.D. Vance, who of course is the vice president, go over and lecture Europeans and side with Germany's far right, which of course just won the elections there, and the further right in Germany also being emboldened by a lot of forces in America, particularly Elon Musk. So this is not something that can be undone quickly. In a couple of years, it is something that is a remarkable and surprising, even given what we know about Donald Trump, even given his rhetoric, even what we know about his base, the fact that he has so easily been able to transform America's place in the world and have Republicans fairly in lockstep go along with him is still quite surprising and remarkable and dangerous, in fact.
You mentioned that word transactional, and that's a word that came up a lot right after the election. There were some countries who said, we actually prefer Trump's style of transactional foreign relations. We don't like getting lectured by people like, Obama or Biden about like our values, our morals. I feel like a month into this administration, I wonder if some of them are reevaluating whether Trump is actually transactional. Is he actually doing a deal where both sides get something, or is he just kind of bullying countries into submission? But Andreas, what do you think?
Well, I think you just nailed it. First of all, I mean, I have some sympathy. For example, to name one country, India. India is exactly the kind of country that was always annoyed about being lectured. and actually is itself transactional, that is used to deal making and quid pro quo and that sort of thing, and was and I think is quite open to Trump, and lots of other countries are like that. The problem is, as you said, a transaction, as the word implies, trans, it means across, there's a quid pro quo, you're supposed to get something in return. And then you look at what Trump allegedly gets in return, and I see actually nothing. In fact, quite a lot of countries, Colombia, Panama, once Rubio leaves from gets back into his airplane and flies away, they're saying, actually, we didn't have to do anything. This was a reality television show. He bullies them, threatens. They say they're going to change something, but it's not clear what, because that's exactly what they did before. I mean, so for example, if you lie that the Panama Canal is controlled by the Chinese, then you send Rubio down to visit the Panamanians. The Panamanians cave to your threats. Rubio flies back and says the canal is no longer controlled by the Chinese. What was the transaction? It's exactly the same as before. So Trump, this is essentially, I think you see not so much the deal maker in Trump, you see the reality television star who wants to pretend there are transactions that are genius going on. But we'll see what happens with these rare earths, by the way. Russia is now offering to give him rare earths in the part of Ukraine that it controls. It gets more and more sinister, if you know what I mean. But these are not transactions where he gets a good deal. I mean, we could start focusing just on that word deal. He is not striking good deals. These tariffs he threatens against other countries would hurt American producers and consumers. What quid pro quo, how will he enrich and lower the price of eggs here if he then delays those tariffs? There are no transactions I see yet. This is part of rhetoric. This is the bubble they're creating. This is the propaganda. We're supposed to think he's a genius transactionalist. I think what I see is chaos and ruthlessness and lack of a moral compass and lack of a hard-nosed, realist, strategic compass as well, and no transactions worth speaking of.
Mm. And now, we are at this point of the U.S. seemingly doing a complete U-turn on Ukraine and siding with Russia. And, Nia, I'm wondering if there is actually any political price that Trump or Republicans will pay for this, because, they say that foreign relations doesn't really influence American voters. Is there a price for selling out Ukraine in this way?
There is a price typically if there is an active war, right, that American troops are involved in. That is obviously not the case with Ukraine. In many ways, I don't think so. I don't think there is a real price to pay for Trump, for his Republican allies, precisely because of the messaging and the reality, I think, in the kind of post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan world, where Americans did feel like they were betrayed by their leaders, that they were marched into these wars, sometimes under false pretenses, and it drained away the resources that Americans feel that they are owed. So in that way, there is a kind of convergence of almost the populist left and the populist right in saying, yeah, Americans should be for Americans. Why should we be spending so much money, billions of dollars, in Ukraine, a place most Americans can't even identify on a map? And so I don't know that there is a political price to be paid for this. I think Donald Trump is obviously after a show, right? He wants a big moment. And Andres and I talked about this. I think he sees himself as someone who could win the Nobel Peace Prize. He sees himself as somebody who maybe on the White House lawn, Putin's on one side, Zelenskiy's on the other, he's in the middle, and there's a handshake, right? And this is the big picture that makes it on the cover of the Washington Post and Time magazine. So that's what he is after. In the meantime, there's kind of just chaos for nothing, and him going from pillar to post and making these comments pro-Putin. Zelensky's the real dictator. And, I do think Americans, there is a sense, and this in some ways doesn't have anything to do with Ukraine necessarily, but there is a sense that maybe Donald Trump is a bit distracted, that he is paying too much attention to these other issues and not paying enough attention to the core of his promise, which was immigration and deportation, which isn't going as well as he promised it would. And then the price of eggs and just affordability. I mean, you see, for instance, that America has to import billions and billions and billions of eggs from Turkey, right? Here he was running as somebody against a weak president and who was going to make America #1 and strong. And now we have to import eggs from Turkey. Which, I think should be on the front page of every newspaper, because it really, I think, speaks to this moment and speaks to the kind of president that Trump promised to be, and the kind of president he actually has been over these last 30 days or so.
Yeah, and it is striking, because if you look at polling, 2/3 of Americans think he's not doing enough on prices. Majorities of Americans do not want to do things like his proposal to take Gaza, whatever that would look like. Most Americans do not want that. And there has been a lot of this kind of foreign policy stuff in the news, more than some of the domestic priorities. There used to be this common saying in politics that domestic politics stops at the water's edge. I'm not sure that that's always been true. And it seems especially untrue now, because, you've got Democrats lined up against Ukraine. You've got Republicans kind of grudgingly lining up against Russia following Trump's lead. Andreas, what does it do to the U.S. and our sort of influence in the world if every 4 years we elect a president who wildly has a sort of ping pong different strategy from the one that we just had?
First of all, I'm still savoring the Turkish eggs. So thank you for framing our discussion, bringing it to the appropriate level of analysis. Yeah, I think that's the headline. The water's edge. That goes back to Senator Vandenberg, who was a Republican who supported the foreign policy of President Truman, a Democrat. And so they set a standard, as it were, that you meet or don't meet. But for the entire Cold War and much of the time after, the unipolar moment when America was a hyperpower, there was a certain consensus that America stood for certain things. Democracy, the leader of the free world, the Pax Americana, the American century, a certain rules-based order. It was often hypocritical. And there were very great differences between Republicans and Democrats and within the parties. If you just think in terms of a Carter and a Reagan, they had a very different approach to things, or a Nixon and a Carter. But there was a common stance, shall we say, toward Europe. There was not just more than a tripwire, but there was a credible presence in West Germany, West Berlin, that deterred successfully the Cold War, and a nuclear stance to go with it. And that spanned parties and spanned administrations, Democrat and stuff. The fact that is now totally gone, and that, as Nia described, the Republicans have made themselves a rubber stamp parliament, essentially, is a great tragedy, and contributes to this chaos and this corrosion of the alliances, and this risk of miscalculation by adversaries, because it is clear that Trump and MAGA are on a completely different planet and want to take America to a completely different planet, and that there's no consensus. Nothing stops at the water's edge anymore. It is global, and that is frightening. And I think and I hope that Americans, even supporters of Trump, who probably didn't pay attention primarily to foreign policy, that they wake up to it. Because, the problem is, NATO was founded in 1949. It's been so long, we have no memory why we created these things. It is because it's cheaper to deter a war rather than to let them happen, wait till they're global conflagrations, and then we have to go in at much greater cost.
Yes, and a cost of lives, and not just treasure. So, Nia, you had mentioned earlier that there is this kind of strange realignment happening where Republicans, who used to be a very hawkish party, are becoming very isolationist under Trump. Democrats are not fully comfortable with the mantle of being like a pro-war, pro-intervention party. And it's hard to imagine now, that there would be any political will to, if China invades Taiwan, or if Russia decides we've got Ukraine, let's go for Poland, that there would be will in the U.S. to stand up to that kind of aggression. But, is there any sort of political constituency in the U.S. that would be willing to use force or the threat of force to project America's interests on the global stage?
Yeah, I think there is some appetite for that among a vanishing few Americans, and some sort of blended Democrat and Republican elected officials on the Hill, right? That it is worth it to stand up for these American values. That, listen, I mean, if you think about the last election, that was central to what Kamala Harris was campaigning on, right? Democracy and freedom, America's place in the world. And Americans kind of thought it was too far away from the kind of bread and butter issues that they wanted to focus on, whether it was immigration or crime or the price of bacon, as Donald Trump talked about endlessly on the campaign trail. And so, again, I mean, I think, obviously 1949, the last world war, is something that doesn't really exist in the immediate memories of most Americans. What does exist, I think, are the more recent wars, right? Where Americans did go abroad, where America did try to plant the flag of a nation building and democracy, and that didn't work. And a lot of that was just built on lies. And so that, I think, is sort of in the memory of Americans now. And the idea that you're going to go abroad, spill treasure and blood in defense of democracy and freedom for another country, I think most Americans say, well, what about us? What about our schools? What about what's going on in this country? And that, again, is on the left and the right, and certainly I think binds together working class Americans, who, again, would be the folks on the front lines if there were some sort of will to go to war to defend another country and to plant the flag for democracy.
Mm-hmm. So there's this, as you say, there's sort of this isolationism that has really come about in part in response not only to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but a generation of people my parents' age who had to fight the Vietnam War, which was also popular. I'm wondering, this rising U.S. isolationism, Andreas, who benefits the most if the U.S. withdraws?
First of all, I've stopped using the word isolationism, which I used to use to describe him, because Trumpism is not that. It is more of a nationalism or an imperialism. That's the better word, because that's what he's after. So if you notice, he's actually very engaged, very interventionist, just in the worst possible way, in the opposite way of what America used to stand for. So I wouldn't call it isolationist, which I would have had some sympathy for. But which countries, I think you asked, stand to not benefit but lose? And it's quite clear, just to make it simple, small countries. In the old world of imperialism, which was the norm for centuries, really, if you think of the 19th century, it was always small countries that lost. Poland got carved up not once, but several times between Prussia and Russia. That's the sort of thing that happened to small countries. That's the sort of thing that Trump and Putin and Xi maybe would like to do again. The Pax Americana, the American hegemony era, the American century, the rules-based order, terrible term, I agree, but it's that America stood for, somewhat hypocritically, but stood for, was a world in which small countries were safer, felt better, were more prosperous, which is why, counterintuitively, even though America was by far the most powerful countries in the Cold War, many small countries supported it rather than formed alliances against it, which, according to balance of power theory, you would normally expect in international relations. America used to stand for a world in which small countries were safer. America now stands for a world in which small countries, and not the big bad countries, but the small countries, have a lot to fear. Look at Panama, Colombia, Canada, Denmark, and Greenland. In Canada, they now have a terrible, macabre joke. They're talking about Canschluss, Canadian Anschluss, if you catch the reference. That's what small countries now have to fear. They're the ones to lose, and Ukraine is first.
Mhm. Well, a stunning reversal in just a couple of weeks. And thank you both for joining us today to hash through it. And thanks to everyone who watched. You'll see us again soon.